The vessel descended through clouds that had not existed for centuries, and Siora pressed her face against the viewing port and watched. Earth emerged from the mist like a dream taking solid form, and what she saw made her wings spread involuntarily. In a gesture of pure wonder, the planet was green and blue and alive, but it was not wild, and it was not random, and every forest grew in patterns that spelled words when viewed from above, and every mountain had been shaped with intention, and every coastline curved with meaning, and Earth had become the largest memorial ever created. This is what we built with our grief, Yuna said, and her voice was soft as she stood beside the delegation and watched their reactions. We could not save everyone, and billions died before we could preserve them. And we decided that the planet itself would carry their names, Ambassador. Choi's skin had gone through every color she possessed and settled on a deep blue that indicated profound emotion, and she said, "You transformed your entire world into a grave marker, into a garden of remembrance, and every tree was planted for someone who died, and every stone was placed with care, and every river follows a path that means something to someone, and we spent 3 centuries making our home into a monument." The vessel landed in a meadow that rippled with flowers in 100 colors, and the delegation stepped onto Earth's surface and felt gravity that was lighter than expected, and breathed air that was cleaner than any they had known, and Park knelt and touched the grass with trembling claws. "This species," Shun said, and her implants were recording everything, but her voice held none of its usual clinical detachment. "They lost their world and rebuilt it as a temple to their dead, and I have studied 1,000 civilizations, and none of them ever did anything like this." Yuna led them through the meadow and toward a structure that seemed to grow from the hillside, and the walls were made of something that resembled stone but responded to touch, and the interior was filled with light that shifted and changed like living memory. "This was once called Korea," Yuna said, and the word carried weight that the delegation could feel. "My ancestors came from this land, and when we rebuilt our bodies, we kept our connections to place and heritage. And I was reborn here 7 times. She showed them records of the transformation and images of humans working for generations to reshape their world, and the debates about what the memorial should include, and the arguments about whose name should be written largest, and the compromises that emerged from love rather than politics. Every human who lived before the event is named somewhere on this world," Yuna explained. "We used every surface and every material and every technique we could devise, and some names are written in stone, and some in living plants, and some in the patterns of lights that appear at night." "How many names?" Siora asked. 7.3 billion. The number hung in the air, and Commander Park, who had seen battlefields and mass graves and the aftermath of wars that consumed entire systems, felt something break inside him, and his scales went pale, and he sat down heavily on a bench that seemed to rise from the floor to meet him. "I have been a soldier my entire life," he said, and his voice was rough. "I have fought enemies and protected my people, and I have never questioned whether violence was sometimes necessary, and now I stand here and see what you built instead of weapons, and I do not know what to think." "We built the weapons too, Commander," Yuna reminded him gently. "We did not choose peace because we were weak, and we chose peace because we were strong enough to make a different choice." The tour continued through forests where every tree was tagged with names and histories, and through cities preserved beneath protective domes, where the delegation could walk streets that humans had walked before the event, and see homes and shops and schools frozen in time. "Like amber, we keep these places exactly as they were," Yuna said as they walked through a city that had once been called. "So, the people who lived here are gone, but their spaces remain, and sometimes we come here to remember what ordinary life felt like before everything changed." Chun examined the technology that maintained the domes and asked questions about preservation methods and power sources, and Yuna answered with the patience of someone who had explained these things many times, and Ciora noticed that other humans were watching them from a distance. They are curious about you. Yuna said when she saw Ciora looking, most of us have never seen an alien in person, and we watched your broadcasts and your entertainment, but meeting you is different. They are afraid of us? Some are, and some are excited, and some are uncertain. And we are not so different from you in that way. And we feel all the things we always felt, and we just feel them in different bodies. Now, Ambassador Choi had been quiet for a long time, and she finally spoke as they stood before a wall that stretched beyond sight in both directions, and was covered in names carved so small they could barely be read. You said, "Earth was your greatest achievement and your deepest wound. And I understand the achievement now, but what is the wound?" Yuna's expression changed, and something ancient and painful moved behind her eyes, and she reached out to touch a name on the wall and said, "The wound is that we could not save everyone, and the wound is that we had to choose who would live and who would die, and the wound is that some of us made those choices, and some of us still cannot forgive ourselves." You mean the founders? My grandmother chose which children would be preserved when there was only capacity for 1 in 10, and she chose based on genetic diversity and psychological stability and potential contribution to survival, and she saved humanity by condemning millions of children to death, and she has lived with that for 8 centuries. The delegation fell silent, and Ciora thought about the memorial rituals she had performed and the comfortable grief of mourning species she had never known, and she realized that human grief was different because humans carried their dead with them, and humans made their lost ones part of everything they built. We want to rejoin the communion, Yuna said, and her voice was steady despite the emotion beneath it. We want to share what we have learned and help other species and contribute to the galaxy. And we also want something else. What? We want to be forgiven, and we know that forgiveness must come from within, but we have been alone with our guilt for so long, and we hope that knowing us might help. And we hope that seeing what we chose to become might ease the weight we carry. Park stood and walked to the wall and found a name at random and traced the letters with his claw and said, "This person and what was their life?" Kim Soyeon, and she was a teacher, and she taught young children to read, and she died in the first wave of radiation when the shelters were not yet complete, and she gave her place in the evacuation queue to a student's family, and that family survived, and their descendants helped design the orbital cleaning systems. You remember all of them? Every name has a story, and every story is preserved. And we will never forget, because forgetting would mean they died for nothing. The delegation stood before the wall of names as the sun moved across the sky and cast shadows that were themselves designed to form patterns and messages, and Ciora understood finally what made humanity different from every other species she had studied. They did not merely survive, and they did not merely remember, and they made survival and memory into the same thing, and they built their future on foundations of grief transformed into purpose. I will recommend that the communion accept you, Ambassador Choi said, and her voice carried the weight of decision, not because of your technology or your power, but because of this, and because you turned your tragedy into something beautiful. Yuna smiled, and the expression held centuries of hope finally fulfilled, and she said, "Thank you, Ambassador, and there is one more thing we would like to show you before you return to make your report." What is it? The message we have been preparing for 800 years, and the answer we believe the galaxy deserves. The Central Assembly of the Galactic Communion, filled with representatives from over 4,000 species, and the chamber hummed with voices speaking in 100 languages, and translators worked constantly to ensure that every word was understood by every delegate. And at the center of the vast space, Ambassador Choi Yoonji prepared to deliver the most important report of her career. 6 months had passed as the delegation returned from Seoul, and in that time the galaxy had changed in ways both subtle and profound, and rumors had spread, and debates had raged, and fear had grown, alongside hope, and now the moment of decision had arrived. Honored delegates. Choi began, and her silver skin glowed with the steady amber of confidence. I come before you to speak of humanity, and to recommend their acceptance into our community. The chamber erupted with voices, and some shouted support, and others demanded caution, and the militant orthodoxy's representative rose to his feet with scales flushed dark red and called for immediate quarantine of the Sol system, and the chaos continued until the assembly speaker restored order. Let the ambassador complete her report. The speaker commanded, and silence fell, and Choi continued. She told him about the signal and the journey, and the first contact, and she described Shin Yuna and the other humans they had met, and she explained the transformation that humanity had undergone, and the weapons they had built, and the choice they had made not to use them. They could have conquered us, Choi said, and her voice carried across the vast chamber. They had 8 centuries to develop technology beyond our understanding, and they had reasons to hate the universe. That allowed their near extinction, and they had power enough to take whatever they wanted. And yet they waited, said a delegate from the merchant conclaves, and her tone held the skepticism of someone who had seen too many deals go wrong. Why should we believe their patience was genuine? Because of Earth, Choi answered, and she activated the display. That showed images of the transformed planet, and the Garden of Names, and the preserved cities, and the mountains carved with faces, and the forest that spelled words of remembrance. They spent 3 centuries building a memorial to their dead, instead of weapons to avenge them. The images cycled through the evidence, and delegates who had dismissed humans as primitives fell silent as they saw what grief transformed by wisdom could create. And Siora watched from the visitors' gallery, and felt her wings trembling with the same emotion she had felt when she first stood on human soil. I request permission to speak, said a voice, and the assembly turned to see Yoon. Siora standing, and the speaker granted her request, and she descended to the floor with her compound eyes reflecting the light of 10,000 watching delegates. I am an alchemist, she said, and her voice was smaller than the ambassador's, but it carried in the sudden stillness. I have spent my entire career studying lost species and performing memorial rituals and adding names to walls, and I thought I understood what it meant to remember the dead. She paused and looked at the display still showing Earth and said, I was wrong, and I performed rituals, but humans built cathedrals, and I spoke words, but humans shaped continents, and I remembered with ceremony, but humans remember with every breath and every choice and every moment of their transformed existence. Commander Park Doha stepped forward next, and his scales had shifted to colors that his species used only for moments of profound truth-telling, and he said, I was prepared to destroy them, and I believe they must be threats, and I have fought enemies my entire life, and I know what danger looks like. He looked at the delegates, who represented military powers and strategic alliances, and said, These humans are not our enemies, and they are not even our equals in the way that matters most, and they faced extinction and chose to become better instead of stronger, and I have never seen courage like that on any battlefield. The debate continued for hours, and voices rose and fell, and factions formed and dissolved, and slowly the momentum shifted as more delegates spoke of what the evidence revealed and what humanity's choice meant for the galaxy's future. We face a question today that we have never faced before, the assembly speaker said when the debate finally quieted. We are asked to accept a species that died and was reborn, and that transformed itself beyond recognition while maintaining its essential nature, and we are asked to trust that their choice of peace is genuine. Shin Yuna stood in the observer section with other human representatives, and her calm expression masked centuries of hope and fear and uncertainty, and she watched the delegates prepare to vote as she thought about a grandmother and the founders and the billions of names carved into Earth's surface. The vote will now commence, the speaker announced. The results appeared on the display in real time, and green lights for acceptance and red for rejection, and the chamber held its breath as the numbers climbed, and Ciora found herself counting and hoping and praying in ways she had never done before. When the final tally appeared, the green outnumbered the red by a margin that surprised everyone, and the chamber erupted in sounds that spanned the full range of alien expression, and somewhere in the chaos, Yuna smiled, and tears formed in eyes that had been rebuilt 7 times and still knew how to cry. The ceremony of acceptance took place 1 week later at the memorial station, where the signal had first been received, and representatives from across the communion gathered to witness humanity officially joining the galactic community, and Ciora stood at the Wall of the Lost with a tool in her hand. "Archivist Yoon," said Ambassador Choi, and her silver skin glowed with celebration colors. "The honor is yours." Ciora approached the wall and found Earth's name among the 3,000 lost species, and she activated the tool and began to carefully remove the letters, and beside her, Yuna watched with an expression that held 8 centuries of longing finally fulfilled. "We are removing you from the list of the dead," Ciora said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "We are acknowledging that you survived and returned and chose to be better than your tragedy. We carried your grief with us." Yuna replied, "Every memorial broadcast and every ritual and every word spoken over our graves, and we listened and we were grateful, and now we want to carry hope instead." The last letter came free, and Ciora held the stone fragment in her hand and offered it to Yuna and said, "This belongs to you now, and do with it what you will." Yuna took the fragment and looked at it for a long moment, and then she walked to the viewing port and opened it, and cast the stone into space, where it would drift forever among the stars that humanity had once longed to reach. "We do not need memorials anymore," she said. "We are our own memorial, and every human carries the names of the lost within them, and we will never forget. But we are ready to create new memories now." The beacon that had transmitted grief toward Earth for 3 centuries activated one final time, and Ciora had programmed the new message herself and broadcast outward toward Sol, and toward the Garden Planet, and toward the billions of names carved in stone and wood and light. "We are the Galactic Communion," the message said, "and we welcome humanity home." In the chamber, delegates applauded and celebrated, and began the long process of integration and cooperation, and somewhere on Earth, a woman named Shin Yuna's grandmother stood in a garden that had once been a graveyard, and listened to the stars, and smiled for the first time in 800 years. The lost had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same, and somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the ancient weapons that had tried to exterminate intelligent life continued their patient work, but they would find humanity ready, and they would find humanity's allies ready beside them. Not because humanity had built weapons of their own, but because humanity had built something stronger, and they had built trust, and they had built memory, and they had built a choice to be better than their fear. And that choice, echoing across the cosmos, would be the answer that changed everything, and the answer that proved survival was only the beginning, and the answer that showed what a species could become when they refused to let tragedy define them. Humanity was no longer lost, and humanity was home, and the memorial beacon fell silent at last because there was nothing left to mourn and only futures left to build. The docking tube connected the 2 vessels with a soft sound that reminded Ciora of breathing, and the delegation walked through the passage with weapons holstered, but hands ready, and Ambassador Choi led them into the unknown with her silver skin flickering through colors that had no names. Shin Yuna waited for them in a chamber that seemed to grow from the walls rather than being constructed, and the surfaces were warm and responsive, and the light came from everywhere and nowhere, and the air tasted clean in a way that none of them had ever experienced before. "Welcome to the homecoming," Yuna said, and her voice echoed strangely, as if multiple voices were speaking in harmony. Just beneath the surface. This vessel has carried me across the system for the past century, and it knows me as well as I know myself, Commander Park kept. His hand near his weapon, and his scales had gone completely black with suspicion, and he asked the question that had been building since they first saw the signal. What are you? Yuna tilted her head, and the gesture was human, but the precision of the movement was not, and she said, I am human, and I am Shin Yuna, and I was born in what you would call the 3rd century after the event. And I have lived and died and been reborn 7 times since then. Died and reborn? Chun's implants flickered rapidly as she recorded everything. You mean your consciousness was transferred to new bodies? Something like that? Yuna said, and she gestured for them to follow, and they walked through corridors that shifted and changed as they moved. When the event happened and the sun tried to kill us, we had only primitive technology by your standards, and we were just beginning to understand the relationship between mind and matter, and we were not ready. She led them to a chamber where images floated in the air and showed Earth, as it had been before the event, and blue and green and alive with cities and forests and oceans, and the delegation watched as the sun flared with impossible violence and the radiation swept outward like a wave of death. The event was not natural, Yuna said, and her voice carried the weight of centuries of investigation. Something was buried in our sun, and something ancient and patient, and it waited until we began sending signals into space, and then it activated. A weapon? Park asked. A sterilization system, and we found evidence of it in over 100 other stars, and every one of them circled by dead worlds that once held promising species, and someone or something decided long ago that intelligent life should not be allowed to spread, and they seeded stars with extinction. The images changed and showed humanity's response to the event, and the desperate scramble to preserve what could be preserved, and the massive projects to upload minds and store genetic patterns, and the failures that claimed billions before the technology could be perfected. We lost most of our population in the first decade, Yuna said, and her calm voice cracked slightly on the words. My grandmother was among the first to be successfully preserved, and she watched her husband and children die of radiation sickness while she waited to be uploaded, and she carried that grief into the digital realm, and she carries it still. Siora felt her wings trembling, and she asked, Your grandmother is still alive? She is one of the founders, and there are 417 of them remaining, and they remember what we were before we became what we are now, and they guide us when we lose our way. The tour continued through chambers filled with technology that none of them understood, and Chun asked questions that Yuna answered with patience and clarity, and the picture that emerged was both terrifying and inspiring, and humanity had rebuilt itself from the edge of extinction through will and genius and sacrifice. The radiation zone, Choi said as they entered what appeared to be a garden filled with plants that glowed softly in the dim light. You said something was cleaning the system. We built machines that consume radiation and convert it to energy, and it took 3 centuries to design them and 2 more centuries to deploy enough of them to make the system safe. And we wanted to rejoin the galaxy, but we could not invite visitors to a death trap. Park had been silent for a long time, and his scales had shifted to gray, which indicated deep thought, and he finally spoke. You have had 8 centuries to develop your technology, and you cleaned the radiation zone that should have lasted millennia, and what else can you do? Yuna stopped walking and turned to face him, and her expression shifted to something that might have been sorrow or might have been shame, and she said, We can do terrible things, Commander, and that is why we stayed hidden for so long. She led them to a sealed door and placed her hand against the surface, and the door opened to reveal a darkness that seemed to swallow light, and they descended into the depths of the vessel and emerged in a chamber that made Park draw his weapon despite himself. Weapons filled the space, and devices that pulsed with contained energy, and systems that Chun's implants could not analyze, and the scale of destruction they represented was obvious, even without technical understanding, and these were not defensive tools, and these were instruments of annihilation. We found the species that created the stellar weapons, Una said, and her voice was quiet now. Traces of them across the dead systems, and enough of their technology to understand how they thought, and we learned, and we built, and we became capable of doing to others what was done to us. You could destroy fleets with this, Park said, and his voice held something like respect mixed with horror. We could destroy worlds, and we could crack planets and sterilize systems and end civilizations before they knew we existed, and we could become exactly what tried to kill. U.S. Ambassador Choi's skin had gone pure white, which indicated profound emotion, and she asked, "Why show us this?" "Because we want you to understand what we chose not to be," Una said, and she walked among the weapons like someone walking through a graveyard. "We built these capabilities because we were afraid and angry and grieving, and we wanted to make sure nothing could ever threaten us again, and then we looked at what we had created, and we were ashamed." "You never used them?" "Never, and we made a choice, and we decided that survival was not enough, and we decided that we wanted to be worthy of survival. And so we waited, and we healed, and we watched your communion grow, and we listened to your memorial broadcasts, and we let ourselves grieve properly before we returned." The delegation stood in silence, and Ciara thought about the species she had studied throughout her career, and the patterns of violence and expansion that defined so many civilizations, and she had never encountered a species that built weapons of ultimate destruction and then chose peace. "What do you want from us?" Choi asked. Una smiled, and this time the expression was purely human and warm and hopeful, and she said, "We want to come home, and we want to rejoin the community. We never had the chance to know, and we want to share what we have learned and help prevent other species from facing what we faced. And if we say no, then we will wait, and we have become very good at waiting, and we will continue cleaning our system and remembering our dead and hoping that someday you will be ready to accept us." Park holstered his weapon with deliberate care, and his scales had shifted to a color that Ciara had never seen before, and he said, "I came here expecting to find monsters or machines or some threat that needed to be destroyed, and instead, I find humans. We are still human, Commander, and we changed our bodies and our minds and our technology, but we never changed our hearts, and we still love and grieve and hope and fear, just as we always did." The chamber fell silent, and the weapons hummed with potential that would never be unleashed. And Ambassador Choi made a decision that would echo through history, and she extended her hand in a human gesture of greeting that she had learned from ancient broadcasts. "Take us to Earth," she said. "Show us who you really are." Una took her hand, and her grip was warm and firm and human, and she said, "Earth is why we waited so long, and Earth is our greatest achievement and our deepest wound, and I hope you will understand when you see it." The delegation followed her back toward the light, and behind them the weapons remained silent and unused and waiting for an enemy that humanity had decided never to create. The diplomatic vessel Lasting Horizon cut through the darkness of space toward a star that had been forbidden for 8 centuries, and inside the ship tensions grew with every passing hour as the crew drew closer to answers that might be better. Left unknown Ambassador Choi Yoonji stood at the observation window and watched the stars blur past and thought about the mission that the communion had entrusted to her, and she was Sithrani with silver skin that shifted color based on emotion. And right now, her skin was the pale blue of deep uncertainty. "Ambassador," said Commander Park Doha as he entered the observation deck, and his scales were dark with the perpetual suspicion that defined his species, and he carried himself like someone expecting an attack at any moment. "The science team has finished analyzing the signal patterns. What did they find?" "Nothing that makes sense," Park said, and his frustration was evident in the way his claws clicked against each other, and he had been military his entire life, and he understood threats and responses, and this situation fit no pattern. He recognized the transmission technology is unlike anything in our records, and the signal traveled faster than it should have. Choi nodded because she had expected something like this, and a species that survived extinction for 8 centuries would not emerge unchanged, and whatever humanity had become would be different from the creatures who had broadcast music and arguments into the void so long ago. Science Officer Chun Han-yul arrived next, and she was from the technocratic enclaves, and her cybernetic implants glowed softly beneath her translucent skin, and she carried a data tablet that she held like a precious artifact. Ambassador, I have been studying the human broadcasts from before the silence, and I believe I understand something important about their psychology. Tell me, they imagine their own destruction constantly, Chun said, and her voice held the clinical detachment of a scientist, but also something like awe. Their entertainment was filled with stories of apocalypse and extinction and catastrophe, and in almost every story they wrote themselves surviving and rebuilding and continuing. Park made a dismissive sound. Primitive species often fear their own mortality and create fantasies to cope. No, said Yoon Seora as she emerged from the corridor, and her wings caught the light as she moved, and her compound eyes fixed on the commander with an intensity that silenced his objection. Other species feared extinction and either surrendered to despair or fought blindly against fate, but humans practiced extinction in their stories, and they rehearsed survival again and again until it became part of their nature. The ship's alert system chimed, and the pilot's voice announced that they were approaching the outer boundary of the Sol system, and that radiation levels were decreasing instead of increasing. And this was another impossibility to add to the growing list. Decreasing? Park moved toward the command deck with his hand on his weapon. That zone should be lethal for another 10,000 years at minimum. They gathered on the command deck and watched the sensor displays, and radiation that had killed every ship sent to investigate was fading like morning mist. And something had been cleaning the system and preparing it for visitors, and Choi felt her skin shift to the yellow of dawning understanding. They knew we would come, she said. They have been waiting. The communications array activated without warning, and the crew froze as a new signal filled the ship, and this time the message was longer and more complex, and the translation matrix worked for several seconds. Before displaying the words, "Please reduce speed, and we will come to you," Park drew his weapon and shouted orders, and soldiers took positions throughout the ship, and Seora watched the panic spread with compound eyes that saw movement in spectrums beyond normal sight, and she saw something else in the crew, and something that looked like hope struggling against fear. "We should turn back," Park said, and his voice was steady despite his obvious terror. "This is clearly a trap, and some other species has claimed this system and is using human artifacts to lure us. The signal uses human linguistic patterns," Chun said, and her implants flickered as she analyzed the data. "The emotional resonance matches the original broadcasts, and this is not imitation, and this is evolution, Ambassador." Choi made her decision with the speed that had made her reputation among the Communion's diplomatic corps, and she turned to the pilot and said, "Reduce speed as requested, and hold position at the system boundary." "Ambassador," Park began. "Commander, I understand your concerns, and I share them, but we did not travel this far to flee at the first sign of contact, and if they wanted to destroy us, they would not have asked us to slow down." The ship decelerated and came to rest at the edge of the system, where Sol burned in the distance and looked exactly like the images from ancient records, and looked like a star that had tried to destroy everything that orbited it and failed, and Choi wondered what kind of determination could survive such betrayal. Hours passed, and the crew maintained battle readiness, and Seora spent the time reviewing everything the communion had collected about humanity before the silence, and she listened to music that humans had broadcast into space and felt emotions she could not name stirring in her chest. "What are you hearing?" Chan asked, and she said. Besides Ciora and her implants, recorded the sounds for later analysis. They called this piece Clair de Lune. Ciora said, "It means moonlight in one of their languages, and they wrote it to capture the feeling of light falling on water at night, and I have studied 10,000 species, and none of them ever tried to translate something so simple and so complex into sound. Do you think they are still capable of creating such beauty?" Before Ciora could answer, the sensors detected movement in the asteroid belt, and something was approaching, and the shape that emerged matched nothing in communion records, and it moved without visible propulsion, and it curved and flowed like something grown rather than built. And Park shouted orders that no one followed because everyone was staring. The alien ship, or perhaps the human ship, took position, a respectful distance from the lasting horizon, and a communication request appeared on the display, and Choi accepted it with hands that trembled despite her training. A face appeared on the screen, and it was human, or it had been human once, and the features were symmetrical and calm, and the eyes held depths that suggested centuries of experience compressed into a gaze, and the figure spoke in perfect communion standard. "I am Shin Yuna, and I have been chosen to greet you on behalf of humanity. And we have waited a very long time for this moment." Choi found her voice. "We came because we received your signal, and we came because we needed to know what happened. We survived," Yuna said, and her smile was gentle and sad and ancient all at once. "We survived by becoming something new, and we hope you will not fear what we have become, because we are still who we always were, and we still remember the music and the dreams, and the longing to know that we were not alone." The command deck was silent, and Ciora felt tears forming again, and Park had lowered his weapon without seeming to realize he had done so, and Ambassador Choi took a breath that shook with emotion. She could not hide. "We have so many questions," Choi said. "We have answers," Yoon replied. "And we have something more important, and we have a choice to offer you, and we have been preparing this choice for 800 years. The screen showed the human vessel opening like a flower and revealing a docking port and an invitation, and Choi looked at her crew and saw fear and wonder and curiosity and hope, and she made her decision. "We accept." The memorial station hung in the darkness between stars, where light itself seemed tired and old, and Archivist Yoon Ciora stood before the wall of the lost, with her wings folded tight against her back and her compound eyes reflecting 3,000 names carved in eternal stone. She was Volanthi, and her people had joined the Galactic Communion 12,000 years ago, when humans were still learning to shape metal into tools and dream about the lights in their sky, and now she performed the ritual that her predecessors had performed for 847 years. "We remember Earth," she said in the formal tone required by tradition, and her voice echoed in the vast chamber where representatives of 100 species had gathered to honor the dead. The names on the wall were not individual names, but the names of entire worlds, and entire species that had risen toward the stars only to fall silent before they could join. The great community of minds that spread across the galaxy, and Earth was one of them, and Earth had been silent for so long. Behind her stood her apprentice, Kang Myre, who was young by Volanthi standards and still learning the weight of memory and the importance of carrying forward what others had lost, and Myre shifted with visible impatience as the ritual continued through its ancient forms. "We remember your music," Ciora continued, and she meant this part more than the formal words because she had spent decades studying the broadcast that leaked from Earth before the silence, and she had heard human voices singing about love and loss and hope and fear. And she had wondered what it would have been like to meet them. The ritual required her to recite what was known about each lost species, and for Earth, she spoke of the radio signals that spread outward for 2 centuries before the end, and she spoke of the images humans sent into space, showing their forms in their world and their desperate wish to know they were not alone. They never knew we heard them. Myre whispered when Siora paused, and this was true, and this was the tragedy that made Earth different from the other names on the wall, because most lost species died before they could call out to the universe, but humans called out and received no answer, and then died anyway. The solar event had come without warning according to communion records, and the radiation burst had been beyond anything natural, and ships sent to investigate never returned, and the zone around Sol became a graveyard. That grew more dangerous with each passing century, until the communion declared Earth unreachable and added the name to the wall. We send this beacon as symbol of our grief, Siora said, and she activated the transmission that the memorial station sent towards Sol every year, and it was a gesture only because no one expected an answer. And no one had expected an answer for 300 years since the tradition began. She completed the ritual and turned to face the gathered witnesses, and she saw the usual mix of genuine sorrow and political obligation in their expressions, and she knew that most species came to the memorial because it was expected and not because they truly mourned for worlds they had never known. Alchemist, said Myre, as the crowd began to disperse, and there was something strange in her apprentice's voice that made Siora's wings twitch with sudden attention, and Myre was staring at her personal display with an expression that Siora had never seen before. What is it? The deep space array, Myre said, and her voice cracked on the words, and she looked up at Siora with eyes that held something between terror and wonder and said, "Something is answering." Siora did not believe her at first, because the array detected false signals constantly, and space was full of echoes and reflections and the random noise of dying stars, but Myre was already transferring the data to the main display, and Siora saw the waveform and felt her wings go rigid with shock. The signal came from Sol, and it was not random, and it was not an echo, and it carried structure that matched communion's standard communication protocols, and this was impossible because those protocols did not exist when Earth went silent, and no ship had survived to teach them. "This cannot be correct," Siora said, but her hands were already moving across the controls and running verification algorithms, and every test confirmed what Myre had found, and the signal was real, and the signal was responding to their beacon. Commander Park Doha of the Militant Orthodoxy was the first official to arrive at the station, and he came with soldiers and suspicion, and demanded to know if this was some kind of trick or test, and Siora showed him the data and watched his face go pale beneath his scales. "How long have they been transmitting?" he asked. "The signal began exactly 47 minutes after we sent our beacon," Siora said, "and the timing was too precise to be coincidence, and someone had been waiting, and someone had been listening all along." More officials arrived as word spread through the station, and Ambassador Choi Yunji of the Sithrani Collective brought diplomats and scientists and lawyers, and everyone spoke at once, and everyone demanded explanations that Siora could not give because she did not understand what she was seeing any more than they did. "Can we translate it?" Ambassador Choi asked, and her voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone who had negotiated treaties between species that had been at war for millennia, and the room fell silent. "The message is already in communion standard," Siora said, and she heard how strange this sounded, even as she said it, and she activated the translation matrix, and the words appeared on the main display, and everyone in the room stopped breathing. "We remember you too," 5 words that changed everything that the Galactic Communion believed about the universe, and 5 words that proved humanity had not only survived, but had learned and grown and waited, and Siora felt tears forming in her compound eyes, which was a physiological response she had never experienced before. "What does this mean?" Commander Park demanded, and his hand rested on his weapon, and his scales had flushed the dark color that indicated fear in his species. Ambassador Choi stared at the message for a long moment, and then turned to face the gathered officials, and her expression held the same wonder that Siora felt mixed with something harder and more political, and she said, "It means we need to send a ship." The debate that followed lasted for hours, and voices rose in argument and fell in exhaustion, and Siora stood by the wall where Earth's name was carved, and ran her fingers over the letters, and thought about the species she had mourned her entire career. They had survived, and they remembered. And they had been listening to the memorials all along, and Siora wondered what kind of species could endure 8 centuries of silence, while strangers spoke words of grief over their graves. The answer to that question would change everything. And Siora was afraid of what they might find, and she was also more excited than she had ever been, because this was why she had become an archivist. And this was the moment when the lost returned, and the wall would need to be rewritten somewhere. In the darkness around a star that had tried to kill them and failed a species was waiting, and they had sent 5 words across the void. And those words were both a greeting and a warning and a promise. Humanity was no longer lost, and the galaxy would never be the same.